Even if I should choose to boast, I would not be a fool, because I would be speaking the truth. But I refrain, so no one will think more of me than is warranted by what I do or say, or because of these surpassingly great revelations. Therefore, in order to keep me from becoming conceited, I was given a thorn in my flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it away from me. But he said to me, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest in me. That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weaknesses, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong." The word of God for the people of God.
One of the things I've always prayed for is the gift to sing. I always wished I could sing. And if I could sing today, I would sing, "Great is thy faithfulness, great is thy faithfulness." That's where my voice ends. It is always a pleasure to stand before you each other Sunday, sharing the blessings that God has bestowed upon my life and your lives as well. Today, we are coming to the end of our sermon series, Heavy Hearts. It must have been a gruesome journey for us all as we get reminded of some hard times we face in life. For the past 5 weeks, we explored how God's people can use laments as a tool to navigate through pain and suffering. In short, we could say a lament is a passionate expression of grief, sorrow, or regret. In the Bible, a lament is a kind of prayer of distress, and it is always addressed to God. In other words, lamenting should not be viewed negatively. It's okay to lament before God. And if you were to explore further, you'd actually realize that at some point in his life, Jesus also lamented. I could probably remind you of 2 cases where Jesus lamented. At one time when he saw Jerusalem and how it was rejecting his message, he lamented before God, "Oh, Jerusalem, what has happened to you?" At one time when he was on the cross, he lamented, "Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, my God, why have you forsaken me?" I have a friend in Zimbabwe who, when facing personal challenges, he loves saying, "Life can be a hagamaga, printaquity," I don't know what that means, "and full of all vicissitudes." Sometimes life can be extremely tough, and there are good times and bad times to us all. In our sermon series, Heavy Hearts, we drew most of our lessons from the Book of Lamentations. And Lamentations is believed to have been written by Jeremiah the prophet. Scholars are generally agreed that one of the key themes in the Book of Lamentations is justice. That is, as we read Lamentations, we get to see that the suffering and destruction of Jerusalem was brought to the children of Israel by God. Arguably, God was right to do so, as the people did not listen to him. Therefore, we can say they brought the suffering upon themselves. However, it is also very interesting to note that one of the dominant characters within the Book of Lamentations is God. God is the dominant character in the Lamentations of Jeremiah. God is spoken about and spoken to, but the voice of God is never heard. Various voices within the text speak of God, speak to God, describing both God's actions and God's attributes. And yet, we never get to hear God's voice in the Book of Lamentations. I wish Jeremiah had presented to us a God who speaks to us in times of grief, in times of pain, and in times of suffering. Because I am deeply convinced that our God does speak to us in whatever situations we find ourselves in. And that brings us to our message for today. God's grace carries us, carries believers through difficult times. God's grace carries believers through difficult times. In my few years of living, which is only about 54 years, I've also observed something. Sometimes you face difficulties not because you are doing something wrong. Sometimes you face difficulties because you are doing something right. Sometimes you face difficult times not because you are doing something wrong, but because you are doing something right. That's where I'm taken back to Zimbabwe. In my vernacular language, we say, "Ane bora ndiye anomakwa." Try to learn that language because you will face it in heaven. You'll be forced to speak Shona in heaven. Ane bora ndiye anomakwa. That is, people picture a person possessing a football in a we call it soccer. In a soccer match, if you have the ball, you are the target of tackling. They will tackle you because you have got the football, you have got the soccer ball. So the safest way of avoiding being tackled is to avoid possessing the soccer ball. And if you avoid the soccer ball, then you've got no business to be on the pitch. You need to be substituted. So sometimes you face difficult times not because you are doing something wrong, but you are doing something right. We all experience hard times in life. And there's a very little and sometimes nothing we can do to block those hard times from coming to us. But all we can do is to get better at handling those hard times. We thrive through difficult times, through grief, through life's turmoils, and not by power, but by God's grace. We thrive through difficult times, not by our power or our might, but by God's grace. Hence, my proposition today, as we reflect on God's goodness upon our lives, My proposition is God's grace carries us through difficult times. God's grace carries us through difficult times. Now, Pastor Justin, in his last week's sermon, highlighted most of Jeremiah's laments and how they were answered by God in the New Testament, particularly by Jesus in the Gospels. In our scripture reading today, I must acknowledge that the text has some ambiguities to it, and I will reserve those for some other sermons to come. But I must hasten to say that it is unwise to form some dogmatic conclusions about certain particulars of this text. Now, what is very clear in this text we read today, 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 6 to 10. What is very clear in this text is that a thorn in the flesh that Paul is talking about is an intense, draining and wearying difficulty or affliction. Paul is testifying about a thorn in his flesh. Some of us may not know what a thorn in the flesh is. Ask me after the sermon, and I will tell you what it is like. Walking barefoot in the country and having a thorn pierce you right into your flesh. Then from there, you can talk of a thorn in the flesh. Back home in Zimbabwe, where I grew up, you would not need to go to a doctor to have that thorn removed. My grandma would just bring a pin or a needle and try to prick it out. After such an experience, you can then talk of a thorn in the flesh. And what happens if it remains there? There are always two choices. Either you refuse your grandma to prick it out and it remains there, or you suffer the pain of it being pricked out, and then eventually you have that relief. So in this text, Paul is talking about a thorn in the flesh, which is an intense pain he was going through. And when you read that text, 2 Corinthians chapter 12, from verse 6 to 10, Paul suggests that this thorn in the flesh, of course, it was not a physical thorn. This pain which he was going through, Paul suggests that he suggests that this pain was actually instigated by Satan or the devil. And he also suggests that this pain or this thorn in his flesh, God allowed Satan to inflict him with that thorn in the flesh. Now, we must also observe that Paul alleges that God does not respond positively to Paul's repeated pleading that this thorn might depart from him, might be removed from him. Yet there is no indication that God is upset with Paul at all. It is also important to note that Jesus' answer to Paul, which is part of the sermon topic for today, Jesus' answer to Paul was, "My grace is sufficient to you, for my strength is made manifest or made perfect in weakness." And this was not being punitive to Paul at all. It doesn't suggest that this thorn in the flesh was inflicted upon Paul as a punishment. But that as it may be, the pain, the thorn still in the flesh, Jesus answers Paul's prayer by saying, "Hey, Paul, just like as it is, my grace is still sufficient, even though you are still going through that pain. My grace is sufficient for the power to withstand that pain gives light to my strength, which operates in you." So your ability to withstand the pain speaks volumes about your strength. In my culture, men do not cry, do not wail as a way of crying. We don't, as a way of responding to pain. You are, as a man, you know what I'm talking about. You are taught to groan as a man. When you're going through pain, you don't wail. And in my culture, they would say, don't wail like a lady, like a woman. You're strong. You know what I mean? You know what I mean? I think you know what I mean. So when you go through pain, you demonstrate that you are a man by groaning. And you can boast around that I am strong. Paul is suggesting that the way Jesus answered his prayer is showing him how strong he can endure the pain, as painful as it was. It is not by resigning that we demonstrate that we are strong. So, neither did it make him resign himself to buffeting with a defeatist attitude because of the pain that he was going through. He saw it as something he can boast about. It affirmed in Paul that whenever he suffers any affliction, Jesus' grace and strength will be sufficient to enable him to go through. So, it is, in other words, it is actually an attitude towards pain that makes us thrive through. Perhaps the central message for the church worldwide is that God's sustaining grace is sufficient in the midst of our suffering. In the midst of this COVID-19, which doesn't seem to end. One time we think we are over the crest. The next day we are being asked to mask again and to practice social distance again and to avoid meeting people again. In the midst of all this, God's grace is enough to enable us to pull through. Life will always want to give you 100 reasons to break down and cry. And I want to encourage us today. You need to show life 1,000,000 reasons to laugh and smile, even in those difficult times. When life gives you 100 reasons to cry and break down, show it 1,000,000 reasons to smile and laugh. I always love reminding my friends, especially those that do not know my background, that behind this smile you always see on my face, there's a story that you'll never understand. Behind this smile, there's a story that you'll never understand. If only I had grown up in a world of videos, then you would get to appreciate what I'm talking about. If videos were taken of my life as I grew up and where I am right now, I have all the reasons, 1,000,000 reasons to smile and laugh as I see that any challenge that just comes can never be above what I've already gone through in my life and what I look forward to in my life. It is by God's grace that I'm standing before you, sharing how God's grace has sustained me thus far. Like Paul, at times I feel like bragging about some of these challenges that I've come through. I went through life, and what I went through made me stronger. I'll tell you a little bit of it, just in a second or two. Before I came to America, the government of America requires that you pay a deposit of $5,500 US to the seminary before you're admitted into the United States of America. And that's a lot of money. That's a lot of money. $5,500 in Zimbabwe is unimaginable. But I had this desire. God was calling me to seminary in Chicago, Illinois, to perfect my evangelism skills and to prepare me for more things to come in ministry. What I could afford was $200 a month. And you can imagine how much it took me to pay $5,500. And all along when I was doing that, my family was struggling because that $200 which I was sparing for seminary studies was really like a big chunk taken out of what we were supposed to live on. I thought it was only my family and I who are observing that. But the staff at Garrett saw every month $200 coming in, $200. And they gathered among themselves and got determined that this guy has got to come. We've never seen so much faith from a guy who wants to come to seminary, having to pay almost over a period of 2 years, paying only a deposit, not even the fees. So as soon as I landed, they called each other to gather around me and say, this is the guy who has been paying $200 a month until he afforded the minimum deposit. And I tell you, what else came after that was God's grace. I was given a tuition, 100%, just as a way of appreciating this guy who really, really wanted to come to study. And I thank God I passed with good colors, with good marks. All I'm saying is there are times when you go through hard times, but we never give up. When you sometimes go through difficult times, do you ever feel like giving up? If you are thinking of giving up, I've got some good words, I've got some good advice for you. Life doesn't always play by the rules. At a time when you think it can never be harder anymore, life can kick you in the teeth. Did you hear that? Life doesn't play by the rules. Life kicks in the teeth when you think it can't get harder, any harder. And in that moment, I love what Winston Churchill said. He says, if you are going through hell, then keep moving. If you are going through hell, then keep moving, my dear. I suppose the moral of that statement is that if you stop, you will burn to ashes. If you are going through hell, my brother, just keep moving, otherwise you burn to ashes. And negatives are actually developed in darkness. Stop focusing on darkness and start seeing how good the Lord has been in your life, how good the Lord has pulled you through those difficult times. And I love what Ronald Reagan, our president, our past president of this country, once said. He said, we are never defeated unless we give up on God. We are never defeated unless we give up on God. So, my brothers and sisters, God's grace is sufficient for us. God's grace will always make sure that we pull through. The trick is never give up. Never give up. Just keep moving. Keep moving. That's the message for us today. God's grace is sufficient for us, and it makes us pull through hard times. And we are here to testify that. When the world gives you 100 reasons to cry down and give up, show it the millions of answered prayers. God's grace is there to accompany us through difficult times. Now, if you look at in your bulletins, there are next steps for us to take. I would like to encourage us to memorize Second Corinthians chapter 12, verse 9a. My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Now, as you reflect on that verse, here is what I feel God calling us to do this week. Challenges, difficult times will always be with us. Like they say, you can never stop a bird from flying above you, but you surely can stop it from building a nest on your head. You can never avoid problems, challenges, difficult times, but surely you can get better at handling them. So, let us develop trust in God during times of stress and suffering. Develop trust in God. God's grace is sufficient for us. And let us constantly remind ourselves of what God has done to us in the past. Like we demonstrated during this sermon series, that prayers are still being answered in our days. Let us count on God's love in the middle of our struggles. And finally, let us also try by all means to help others to trust in God during times of stress and suffering.